Throughout this series of videos, there have been several things that I've said that have probably made you wonder what was happening in terms of economic systems with all of this change going on. For example, the typical economic theory in place at the beginning of this unit, the one that played the role in driving colonists in North America to seek independence, or namely mercantilism, was fading away to be replaced by one that you may have heard of: capitalism. Okay, so in 1776, this Scottish philosopher guy named Adam Smith, here he is, looking dapper, published a book called The Wealth of Nations, in which he laid out his theories about how economics work and how to best grow national wealth. I think it's very telling that he named his work The Wealth of Nations and then set out to argue against the most popular theory for developing, the wealth of nations. If you'll remember, mercantilism is an economic policy and set of theories that values exports over imports in order to amass national wealth in the form of hard bullion. According to an Austrian economist, Philipp Wilhelm von Hornig, in 1684, or the heyday of mercantilist thought, here are some of the basic principles. First, every little bit of a country's soil needs to be utilized for agriculture, mining, or manufacturing. That all raw materials found in a country to be used in domestic manufacture, or they need to be, because finished goods have a higher value than raw materials. That a large working population needs to be encouraged. That all exports of gold and silver are prohibited and all domestic money is kept in circulation. That all imports of foreign goods be discouraged as much as possible. That where certain imports are indispensable, that they be obtained at first hand in exchange for other domestic goods instead of gold and silver, right? We're amassing all of that bullion. That as much as possible, imports be confined to raw materials that can be finished in the home country. That opportunities be constantly sought for selling a country's surplus manufactures to foreigners, so far as necessary for gold and silver. And that no importation be allowed if such goods are sufficiently and suitably supplied at home. So these principles and policies lead to some pretty negative consequences. So first off, it requires huge government intervention in and regulation of the economy through high tariffs on necessary imports, banning as many foreign imports as possible, banning shipping using foreign ships, the hoarding of gold and silver rather than the circulating of the currency, and limiting wages. Basically, they view the economy as a zero-sum game. In order for there to be a winner, everyone else has to lose. As the 18th century progressed, these ideas become increasingly criticized. John Locke our political philosopher, will even question the idea that the total value produced in the world economy is even always fixed. But rather, he theorizes that it will grow as human capability for production and population grows. Check and check. Locke is right again. But it's not until Adam Smith publishes, this is the whole title, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations in 1776, that mercantilism can finally be laid to rest. In it, Smith dismisses the idea of trade being a zero-sum game. Instead, he argues against government interference and theorizes the reasons behind wages and productive capacity. One of his most lasting and anti-mercantilist ideas is captured in the phrase laissez-faire, or a hands-free economic system. Smith argues that the government need not restrict the economy through tariffs, subsidies, or any other means, but rather that if the economy is controlled by what he calls the invisible hand of the market, trade and the market will benefit everyone. Essentially, what he's claiming is that the natural and uninhibited interactions between producers and consumers will produce the most beneficial economy for everyone through their negotiations over the large long-term scale. One of the next developments we're going to discuss wouldn't really have been possible under a mercantilist system, but it definitely is under a capitalist one. As the industrial economy increasingly involved more and more of the world and shipping evolved to meet this demand, steamships and expanded telegraph routes, corporations also grew to meet these needs, including what we now call transnational corporations. The Dutch and the British are the true pioneers of this development in the 19th century, with British banks spreading throughout their growing empire, which we'll talk about next unit, and the Dutch integrating corporations doing all kinds of stuff. We're going to talk about one in particular. For a reference, we're going to talk about the year 1865. So in 1865, as the United States was wrapping up its disastrous Civil War, the British had recently very soundly defeated the Chinese for the second time. After the Second Opium War, which don't worry, we're going to talk about that next unit, Hong Kong becomes a British territory, and the British were granted pretty spectacular privileges in China. In this atmosphere, a Scottish executive for the Pacific and Oriental Railroad named Thomas Sutherland thought to himself, gee, we could really use a bank with, sound Scottish principles around here, especially with all of the growing international trade. There's just so many good products and opium to be traded now, and we have to give people access to loans. And so, with that, he sought out financiers to help him create a bank. Shortly thereafter, they opened a large branch in Shanghai and named themselves the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, or HSBC. There also grew to be branches in Japan and throughout Southeast Asia. The creation of the bank also speaks to another economic development of the period. The HSBC was one of the first stocks to be offered for trade in the Shanghai Stock Exchange, which is a whole new idea because the idea of stock markets was really jumping off. Another new development that arises in this time period was the Limited Liability Corporation. You've probably seen or heard the abbreviation LLC after a company name, and now you know that stands for this type of corporation and how it is incorporated with the government authorities where they get their certificate. A limited liability corporation exists to protect its owners or shareholders from liability. Duh. Basically, what that means is that if a company fails, if it goes bankrupt, if it shuts down, the owners are separate from and therefore protected from that loss. Like if my shipping company is destroyed in a hurricane and I can't recover the products for my customers, they can't come after me personally for their losses. This type of incorporation makes people more likely to start businesses and try new things because they don't have to worry about going into debtor's prison or destroying the future of their families if they'd like to start a business. Lastly, we should talk about the effect of industrialization on living standards. Industrial capitalism produced a huge growth in living standards for a lot of people. A new managerial middle class emerged, and consumer products were manufactured on a scale never seen before. The idea of separating out work time from leisure time emerged, and new innovations decreased a lot of the backbreaking labor people had been committed to on farms. Not everyone benefited from this, and working conditions, as we've hinted at and will continue to talk about, were pretty atrocious, along with living conditions in overcrowded tenements with poor sanitation and zero safety precautions. This steep rise in the fortunes of some, while the masses seem to be left behind, will give rise to one of the most important and controversial ideologies in history, Marxism. But we'll be talking about that in the next episode, so definitely hold your horses there. See you then, and thanks for watching.